Step one, we're going to go ahead and dress the wound. So I'm just going to use basically a little 2x2 gauze and paper tape. Let's assume she has her first metatarsal head ulcer. Okay, so we'll apply the appropriate dressing. Next, we're going to put a roll of stockinette. Now, the stockinette doesn't have any compressive properties or anything. This is basically just to serve as a contact layer between the plaster, essentially, and the patient's skin. So the proximal portion of the cast we want to stop about 2 to 3 fingers widths below the fibular head. We don't want the cast to extend to the fibular head because we don't want to compress the common peroneal nerve. That could potentially cause some problems. So I'm going to put my stockinette high enough to where I'm past the patient's fibular head to give me a little extra room. And then I can take some scissors and just cut off some of the excess if needed, because this portion we're just going to roll and tape to the dorsal surface, avoiding any plantar wrinkles. Okay, the next step in the casting application is we're going to pad bony prominences. Bony prominences have a risk of ulceration themselves if anything's too rigid against them, so we're going to pad them well. So the kits that some of you have come with these handy little adhesive pads. So you're going to definitely pad over the lateral and medial malleolus. You can also pad the patient's navicular if they have a prominent one. Okay, and the last area you definitely want to pad is the tibial crest. So I'll start kind of at the crux of the patient's ankle, and again, just tape this felt all the way up the tibial crest. So once I have all my bony prominences padded, I'll go ahead and get the patient in a prone position. A lot of our patients can't tolerate the prone position, but you really, really want to try to get them prone. It's much easier to apply the cast effectively and appropriately. So we'll go ahead and get her to flip prone. Have a sheet available to drape the patient. You just don't want to get plaster or fiberglass all over them. Okay. So once we have the patient's foot visible, we can see where we've placed the dressing through the stockinette. So at that time, we'll go ahead and put a little piece of Safoam over the patient's wound. Now this is kind of one of those variable techniques that a lot of the casting systems don't include. I use it just to provide some localized offloading to the wound. So I'll put a little piece of Safoam again directly over the wound. And then I'll also use another piece of Safoam to cover the toes appropriately. So what I want to do is use this Safoam so the toes are not directly in contact with the plaster. So I want to make sure that I allow the metatarsal heads to still be weight bearing. So I'm going to allow my Safoam to stop kind of in the toe sulcus. So I'll measure that, cut the Safoam appropriately, and then I'm going to bevel my edges. Even though the Safoam material is very kind of plush and formable, even just very small kind of edge pressures can create a problem for these neuropathic patients. So I'll bevel it. And again, leaving the metatarsal heads to be weight bearing. I'm going to cover the toes. And also cut off these little kind of what I call dog ear pieces of Cyfoam. Just basically excess material. Okay. So now that everything's covered, I'm going to start applying some cast padding or web roll. Again, this is just creating some padding in between bony prominences, the skin, and like our plaster or fiberglass materials that can be caustic when they're applied directly. So, again, avoiding wrinkles in this step. See the person holding the patient in a neutral ankle position right now. Their role is crucial. If they don't hold this patient in the appropriate position, I could accidentally cast the patient in a plantar flexion or dorsiflexion, which could significantly affect her gait. So this person is very important. So once I feel like the foot and ankle are padded appropriately, then I'm just going to, again, take my web roll at a kind of a typical 50% overlap around the leg. Again, no compressive property here. I'm just making sure that I'm protecting and padding the leg appropriately. Try to avoid wrinkles as you're doing all of these steps. So I always want to be mindful of, again, where my cast is to stop. When I come to the proximal portion of the cast, I'll usually make a couple go-rounds with my cast padding. That way when I roll my stockinette down, I'm protecting the leg against edge pressures from the plaster. Okay, so now we're ready to start applying our cast material. So the first roll we'll start with is plaster. Kind of a cool bucket of water right here that I'm going to dip this plaster in, wring out some of the excess moisture. You have to work fairly quickly with plaster though, because it sets fast. Once it starts to dry on you, it basically becomes useless. So what I do with the plaster layer is try to create a really kind of intimate contact layer with the foot. Again, my holder is just basically picking up his hands, putting them right back down, again, to help the patient maintain that neutral ankle position. Once I feel like I have a pretty intimate contact with the foot, I'll go ahead and start bringing the plaster down the leg. Okay, so at this step, I'm going to go ahead and roll my stockinette. Don't forget that step. If you wind up with plaster or fiberglass kind of close to patient skin, that can be really uncomfortable and also cause some kind of unwanted wounds. So go ahead and make sure you roll that layer down. So now I've created a nice intimate contact with the foot. The next step will be applying our fiberglass. So you have a 4-inch and a 3-inch fiberglass. We'll reserve the 3-inch for when we apply the rocker bottom. We'll go ahead and use the 4-inch for the actual casting. So really no compression is applied when I'm using this fiberglass. However, you want to make sure when you're rolling it, you keep it pretty close to the patient's skin. If you allow kind of too much lax in the fiberglass, it'll start to get away from you and then it becomes really hard to work with. You can also use this layer to build up any kind of valleys, basically, you have in the patient's foot contour, because in order to secure your rocker bottom effectively, you really need to have a flat surface. So again, you can use that fiberglass to create a flat surface so your rocker bottom can be secure. You have several rolls of fiberglass in the kit, so feel free to use as many as you need to, again, build up the patient's foot contour if they don't have a flat surface to work with. So I'm opening my second layer, or my second roll of fiberglass. Looks like I have a little bit more to build up to create that flat area needed for the rocker bottom. Okay, that looks good now. Okay. Then we can start moving up the patient's leg. Using your stockinette as your boundary, so make sure you're not going past that stockinette with any of your materials. Okay, typically in this step I will wrap the patient's leg in an ACE, and what that does is it just absorbs some of the water that was used to wet the plaster and fiberglass. So I'll usually leave that ACE on about 5 minutes, again, just to make sure I'm working with a dry surface when I apply my rocker bottom. For time purposes, we won't do that today, but again, just to note, I usually use an ACE wrap to absorb the water at this point. Now, the securement of the rocker bottom. This is another kind of method that's variable between casting techniques. Some of the casting systems that are out now use just a walking boot and don't have a particular rocker bottom associated with it. However, we're supplied with rocker bottoms for this casting system. So basically you have here a really just flat surface, and then the rocker bottom is going to allow this cast to be an ambulatory cast. Now, that's not to say that we want the patient to have a lot of activity in their cast, but it will allow it to be an ambulatory cast. So what we'll do is we'll put this kind of flat layer on there again, just to provide us a flat surface. And then with the rocker bottom, what we'll do is try to line up kind of the middle, like this valley of the rocker bottom, where the 90-degree angle occurs between the dorsum of the foot and the tibial crest. So for that, in your casting kit, you have a 3-inch fiberglass roll. So we're going to use a 3-inch to adhere the rocker bottom. So what you'll do, you can kind of use this little valley that's created in the rocker bottom. As a place where you can secure with the fiberglass. And then just start rolling kind of from anterior to posterior to secure the rocker bottom. point, I will apply the ACE. Again, just to get excessive moisture out of the materials. The patient walks on the cast when it's too wet. It can cause it to become very fragile. That is the application of the total contact cast. That is the application of the total contact cast.